Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Picture of the week surely was the sight of the Middle East peace envoy Tony Blair at Ariel Sharon's funeral, emoting like he did that morning when Diana died. I was sure he was going to sob at any moment. Sharon was the people's butcher. Warmly embracing Sharon's son Gilad, the son that is not the two-ton Burger King, who is on record as saying that Gaza, and presumably its nearly 2 million inhabitants, should be flattened like Hiroshima with a nuclear bomb. Blair seems utterly oblivious to the way he's viewed by the 350 million Arabs in the Middle East. Or maybe he just doesn't care.
While to Tony Blair, Ariel Sharon was bold, unorthodox, unyielding. To many, if not most, in the Middle East, Ariel Sharon was the butcher of Beirut for his role in the 1982 massacre of up to 3,500 Palestinians in the Shabra and Shatila refugee camps.
I was in Beirut in 1982 when the Israeli Defense Force invaded Lebanon en masse. I just made it out of the country ahead of the phosphorus bombs and the tanks. I returned immediately after they were forced to withdraw by the Lebanese resistance and went to the two camps that had once been my home, Sabra and Shatila. Some of the dead remained unburied. The stench was unmistakable. The camps were full of wandering, wailing women, children, and old men.
Against the butcher of Beirut, the women, children, and old men in the camps had of course been defenseless, for the Palestinian fighters had all sailed away to a new exile in faraway Tunisia. They did so under a United States guarantee signed by President Reagan's representative, Philip Habib, that their families would not be harmed once they were no longer there to protect them. But before the ink on the promise was dry, their family's blood was running in the open sewers of the camp.
Ariel Sharon stood throughout the night of the massacre on the roof of the Kuwaiti embassy on the perimeter of the camp, directing the giant searchlights and incendiary flares which turned the night into day and illuminated the hovels of the camp, the better for the phalangist militiamen to go house to house with their knives, bayonets, and swords.
Even the Israeli government of the former terrorist leader, Prime Minister Menachem Begin, was forced to set up an inquiry, the Kahan Commission, which concluded with Sharon's responsibility and his dismissal and banning from public office.
None of this narrative made it into the eulogies of Blair and co, so we're devoting this episode of Sputnik to remembering the real Ariel Sharon. Joining us now is a very great Israeli, the antithesis of Ariel Sharon. The deceased Israeli premier was known as the bulldozer, casting away stones. Jeff Halper gathers stones together. Whilst Israeli prime ministers bulldoze Palestinian homes, Jeff rebuilds them as an act of resistance. He's the founder of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He organizes, mobilizes, fundraises all over the world for this noble purpose. Non-violent, direct action and civil disobedience are his tools, and he spoiled many a good day out for the bulldozers. He was once nominated in 2006 for the Nobel Peace Prize, but it turned out he hadn't started enough wars to win it. Our prize is to have him here. Jeff Halper, it's an honor to have you here on the Sputnik. Tell us, first of all, as an American Israeli, 1973, you've been in Israel since. How did the death of Sharon impact on you?
It had a very little impact. I mean, he really died 8 years ago. You know, I think there's been a big distance. He kind of faded. The death was kind of anticlimactic. But I think it marked, you know, it didn't mark an end of an era. In fact, I would say that Sharon has been vindicated to some degree by Netanyahu, because the exclusive militaristic way in which he approached things, I think, is something that's just rooted in Israeli policy. The only way it knows how to react is militarily. Let me say one thing about Sharon, though. He was a big thinker. The whole idea of the Lebanon War was to overthrow Hussein, move the PLO into Jordan, have Jordan be the Palestinian state, and then that relieves Israel of the pressures to give up the occupation. Because here, there is a Palestinian state in Jordan. That was always his mantra. I think what happened here was interesting with Sharon, though. There's one thing that people haven't looked at, and that is, why did he leave Gaza? And actually, there's in Haaretz, a newspaper, the Israeli newspaper, there's reports that he was considering further withdrawals from the West Bank. I think that he, in the very beginning, rejected what was called the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, where the entire Arab League, it was formulated by Saudi Arabia,
Saudi
no less,
plan, yeah.
Said to Israel, if you give up your occupation, we will not only make peace with you, we'll integrate you into the region. And Israel rejected it and didn't even relate to it. But I think Sharon got it. I think after a year or two, he began to see that the subtext was these conservative Arab regimes are really asking Israel to be the regional hegemon. They want Israel to kind of take over the Middle East. I mean, if you take away the occupation, there's a tremendous similarity in foreign and domestic interest between these conservative regimes and Israel. They're on the same page, especially against Iran. And he was in the process of, I think, getting out of a lot of the occupied territories, because even the Arab regime said, look, we have public opinion on our streets. We can't normalize with you as long as there's occupation. Get rid of most of it. I think he thought, and I think rightly so, that the Palestinians would give in enough that he could keep the main settlements, keep most of East Jerusalem, so he didn't have to give up everything, but basically settle with the Palestinians, and then Israel becomes a regional hegemon. Because the part of Israel that people don't, I think, see is that it's not really, I mean, now Netanyahu is a little guy, a little thinker. So he's into Judea, Samaria, settlements, all this little stuff. But Sharon, I think, really wanted Israel to run the Middle East.
So there does appear, from what you say, to be two sides to this man. He was a brute, but not only a brute. He was a butcher, but not only a butcher. So how do you measure the deterioration or otherwise of Israeli political leadership since he left office? You described Netanyahu as a little guy, equally brutal, but with no kind of vision at all.
That's right. Well, we have to remember about Sharon. I don't want to humanize the guy too much. I mean, he was a really brutal, terrible guy. But again, he did have that. He wasn't simply a murderer like like sometimes we think of him. I mean, he was going, so he had this bigger vision. But he wasn't a Likud guy. He wasn't from the right wing. He grew up with Rabin and Moshe Dayan. He was in the Palmach. He was in the labor camp, actually. So when he moved over to the right wing, in his militaristic sense, and began to build the settlements, he was the architect of the settlements with Begin and so on, there was always a pragmatic part of Sharon that came from the Labor Party. Netanyahu was born into the Likud. He was born into the revisionist movement. He's an ideologue. Sharon was never an ideologue. He used violence and brute force and the military, but he used them in a sense, in a practical sort of a way. So in other words, he was able to, I guess, to parlay his military thinking and his violent urge into grand strategies. Netanyahu is an ideologue. He's limited, and all he really cares about is this little Israel that controls the Palestinians and controls the occupied territories.
Do the people on the street of Israel see that as well? That he was the man with the big vision and Netanyahu?
No, I don't think so. I think that big vision part has been lost. I don't think, Sharon got the stroke before he was able to really articulate where he was going. So a lot of this is conjecture. But what I'm saying, if you look back at the Lebanon War of 1982, there was a plan, a big plan, to redo the whole Middle East behind the Lebanon invasion. There was a big plan behind the so-called disengagement from Gaza that I think had to do with Israel becoming a regional hegemon in the Middle East. But then he had the stroke, and he had never had a chance, and partly why I'm saying this is because, remember, he left the Likud. The Likud was too small for him. It was too ideological. It was too confining. He went and set up his own party, Kadima, that would give him that latitude to do these big things.
So the Israeli leaders have been getting smaller. Ever since Golda Meir, I would say. Is that going to continue? How dwarfish can they get, and where is it going?
No, I think it's going to continue. There's no left in Israel. I mean, that's part of the problem, too. I mean, the Labour Party is completely gone almost. There's nobody articulating any kind of a vision of any kind of peace. Labour has become, it calls itself a social democratic party that doesn't even deal with the occupation. The occupation has become a non-issue in Israel. That's where the different governments have succeeded in really taking it off the agenda. People don't think about it. Because inside Israel, it's not an issue. You're not going to move the people.
You can't get a surgeon to operate on his own foot.
Exactly. That's right. That's right. So what you have to do is mobilize the international community. And I think that's happening. It hasn't trickled up yet to the governments. I mean, Cameron is still super pro-Israel and everything else, but I think there's been a tremendous change in public opinion. I think there's been a groundswell, even in the United States, and I think that's starting to trickle up into the governments. I mean, the EU has taken some pretty principled stands recently, and that's our strategy. It's kind of like the South African strategy, in which peace won't come from inside. It won't come. The Israelis aren't going to overthrow the occupation. But when the de Klerk comes, whatever the de Klerk is, whether it's Obama or the UN or the EU or simply international pressures, and the whole occupation becomes unsustainable, I think we're getting there. I think at that point, the Israeli public will not be an obstacle. I think they'll go along with it. But the pressures are going to have to come from abroad, from outside, and that's why we're working to try to influence, mobilize public opinion and governments abroad to put the pressures on Israel that you need to end the conflict.
Jeff Halper, it's been fascinating, as always, talking to you.
Okay, thank you much.
After the break, we'll be talking to another of the world's braver men. He makes films, and good ones. He's becoming a star of the solidarity movement. Entirely voluntarily, he lives in Gaza. His name, inappropriately, is Harry Fear. Welcome back to Sputnik. No man could have failed to live up to his name quite so comprehensively than Harry Fear. He braves bullet, shot and shell in Gaza just like the Palestinians do. He's standing on the front line, taking pictures. You have to be fearless for that. Harry Fear, thanks for joining us after a grueling 23-hour flight from Malaysia. I just wanted to talk to you as someone with a foot in either camp, as it were, a man from the West, living in the East, living on the front line, indeed. What impact do you think the demise of Ariel Sharon, who has dominated the political landscape, even in his coma, over these last decade or more, what impact do you think his demise will have?
Well, I hope that it will close a more bloody passage in Israel's history. I mean, we've seen Palestinians, some of them celebrating this passing from this life to the next, because this is the only act of justice that has ever come to Ariel Sharon. I mean, he totally missed all justice in this life. And for the Palestinians, the largely believing people, of course, this is something to celebrate, that finally power will be wielded against a man who was a butcher, who acted like a psychopath, and who, with the propaganda and hypocrisy of the Western media and Western leaders, has been hailed as some kind of devoted, loving leader for his country and his people. But of course, what that means is that if he did love his country and his people, and he was so true to his country, and he was also a butcher, then it also obviously identifies that his country has a serious problem with blood in its hand generally. And that, I think, is the #1 thing about his passing, which the discerning can see.
The picture of the week had to be the Middle East peace envoy, done up like an Israeli, standing there, emoting as if Princess Diana had just passed. As someone from Britain like me, was that hard to bear?
It was, but I was thinking about that just myself earlier because, you know, the treatment of Sharon as if he was some kind of, I don't know, gift to mankind or some kind of gift to world leadership. And the irony of how he is treated so latently in the Western media. And it's exactly the same with Tony Blair himself. I mean, he is a war criminal, and generally people hate him, and they're disgusted by the mentioning of his name. But in the media, it's nothing like that at all. He's given some kind of parade, and there must be balance and moderation in the comment. You know, it's as if, you know, the Israeli media speak of Sharon as if he, you know, went after peace with Palestinians in the final years. Well, it's like saying Tony Blair went after peace with Iraq and killed almost 1 million people.
Well, they say, for example, that Sharon withdrew from Gaza. But as someone based in Gaza, you know that Israel hasn't withdrawn from Gaza. They control everything that concerns the lives of the people in Gaza.
And the key here is that they say that it was a withdrawal and it was used for propaganda purposes or diplomatic purposes as a gesture of peace and concession. But actually, if you look at it more cynically, if you were him, you would have done that, because then it allows you to consolidate the parts of the West Bank and other parts of the historic Palestinian territory which they can hold on to. And that's what we're seeing now with the negotiations.
Tell us how things are now for the people in Gaza.
Well, to be honest with you, they've got worse, obviously because of the situation in Egypt. The Hamas authorities have lost their ally. The violence is increasing in the last few weeks. I mean, generally after the November 2012 war, in the months following that, things were quieter. There was less tit for tat. But now things are slowly escalating again into a way that they were about 2 years ago. One hopes that that won't continue. But the people are isolated. The besiegement continues in broad daylight against the law, against all morals. And then you have the, you know, France, the UK, and the American politicians then, you know, affectionately applauding Ariel Sharon. I mean, you just couldn't make it up.
What about the recent floods that were a result of the bad weather and heavy rainfall and Israel's control over the dams?
Yeah, I mean, people in Gaza said that when there was the recent storm Alexa, that Israel flooded parts of Gaza to further, you know, damage the population. And there is limited evidence for that. But the key here is that, you know, as I mentioned, it's the siege. The siege is a man-made disaster, and it's the siege which means that Gaza has basically no capacity and infrastructure to deal with natural disasters at all.
And of course, the siege, the destruction of the tunnels, must have meant that the economic situation for the almost 2 million Palestinians in Gaza grew even more catastrophic.
Indeed, the economic situation, and also, I would frankly say, the morale. Because the symbolic cutting off of Egypt, the symbolic lack of support from the Arab countries, from the international community. I mean, Gaza, in a way, is one of the most forgotten places on earth in terms of actual support, perhaps in terms of sympathy among the Muslims, even amongst the Arabs, and increasingly, obviously, the Europeans. People are sympathetic, but political support, zero.
Now, Sharon has gone. Netanyahu, intellectually, you might say, a more dwarfish figure, even more petty and venal figure. How does it look to you? How securely is he in place? Are we in for another decade of Netanyahu?
I don't think so, actually. I think that, I mean, if you take the November 2012 war, which is certainly one of the things that will define him, I believe, I think many Israelis, and according to the polls, they believe that he handled that very badly, and he was forced to give in to a ceasefire. And I think that there is a large contingent of Israelis in politics there who think that he has failed militarily. And failing militarily, of course, is very important in the Israeli currency, because Ariel Sharon, seen as this magnificent leader, was of massive military strategic strength and etc., and of course responsible for massacres in Lebanon. So in Israel, it's almost like, you know, creating blood and terrorizing Palestinians and knocking them into the darkest corners of the earth is success. So Netanyahu, I don't think, is so much established in that image. And I hope for Israel, and I hope for the Palestinians and for the region, that we won't be in for another 10 years with him.
You are a very central figure now in international solidarity with the Palestinian people. What's the current state of play?
I would say that there is a lot of sympathy, there is a lot of yearning for support. I would say that sometimes the support isn't properly galvanized, it's not strategic enough. But of course, at the same time, more subjectively, there are successes which people hold on to. There is, of course, the BDS movement with the boycotts and etc., which there are always successes which are held up for good reason. And I always say the BDS movement as one of the main pincers of the solidarity in terms of actually moving to action and accountability and justice is something which we should support, because BDS and boycotting itself is a very human, intuitive thing. You know, if you have an argument with someone, just walk away. So that's what we're doing with Israel. I would say at the same time there are fractures within the solidarity movement. There is, of course, infighting, as there is with any organisation or movement, and that is obviously very weakening and very difficult for people to deal with. But I hope that the solidarity movement doesn't last much longer, because, of course, the solidarity movement is something which has existed for decades, because the conflict has existed for decades. So I certainly hope it won't be needed much longer. And I think the solidarity movement must find its freshness. It must not become entrenched.
Direct aid into the Palestinians is becoming much more difficult. Once upon a time, as you know, I took many convoys there. I wouldn't be able to do so now. I couldn't travel across North Africa as I did with the first of those convoys. I wouldn't be able to go through Syria as I did with the second or third of those convoys. And now, with Egypt, I don't want to put you in any difficulty, the Egyptian position has markedly changed. Any ideas how we can break that logjam?
Well, there was a petition recently to the Egyptian embassies around the world saying you've got to open the border, at least send it back to how it was a year ago, even if you don't open it up for normal economic and pedestrian traffic. And of course, they met with the claims that, well, if we do anything to improve the border, then Israel will just abrogate its responsibilities towards Gaza, and Egypt, rather Gaza will become a part of Egypt in a pseudo way. But of course, these don't stand up to any humanitarian argument or any moral argument or any regional argument, because Egyptians are brothers with Palestinians in a way that Israelis aren't. Really, the instability in Egypt, I think one of the biggest tragedies is the situation in Gaza, and that's why the situation in Egypt is so vital for Gaza in a very short-term emergency way.
Harry Fear, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. This is where you tell us what you think through our social media roundup, looking at our Twitter and our Facebook. Gayatri, what's rattling?
Well, you remember that Bush and Blair spoke about Ariel Sharon as the man of peace?
Yes.
Well, when I put it that way on Twitter and on Facebook, I received a flood of comments. Rad Cass says, war criminals stick together. See no evil, hear no evil. Layla Hatoum says that there's an Arabic saying, no one would say their own oil is rotten, so murderers won't call out on their own. Ahmad says, if peace means killing of innocent people, then yes, he was a peace champion, along with Bush and Blair. And Majid Al-Ayed says, well, if you believe in Bigfoot, Santa Claus, and the Smurf, then yes, he was a man of peace. All comments like this, it's amazing.
Well, I remember when Bush first said that Sharon was a man of peace, making the point that even Ariel Sharon wouldn't describe himself as a man of peace. But Blair repeated this utter falsehood at his eulogy in the funeral ceremony. I must say that I thought my opinion of Tony Blair could not fall any further. But the sight of him and the sound of him at that funeral really put the tin hat on it as far as I was concerned.
I know.
Go on, any more?
Well, on Facebook, John Lofthouse says, well, we should all trust Bush and Blair. They always tell the truth. And Shafin Ahmed says, some newspapers comment that he's a controversial man, but he's not controversial at all. He's just a war criminal. He's bloodthirsty, and he's a murderer. And you could speak of all three of them.
Yeah,
actually.
but what is interesting is Jeff Halper's testimony that he was, of course, a butcher. He was a murderer, and for more than 50 years. But actually, he had quite a big brain, and he had a strategic vision of making Israel the regional hegemon. the greater Israel from the Euphrates to the Nile, which is what the two stripes on the Israeli flag are supposed to signify. So in that sense, we should be glad that he didn't succeed. Yeah.
Well, the last one from Facebook is from Rahman Lincoln, saying that only a terrorist can call him a man of peace. And that's all that we've got time for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
Keep giving us your opinions, your comments and everything on Twitter at RT_Sputnik, and on Facebook you can find us at Sputnik on Russia Today. That's it from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.